Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. The train that carried Marion Hale into the county of Shropshire on the evening of the 3rd of October, 1887, was the kind of train that seemed to belong to a different era than the one it occupied. It moved slowly, with a deep and unhurried rhythm, as though it had made this particular journey so many times that it had developed a kind of muscle memory, an old patience, a willingness to let the countryside unfold at whatever pace the countryside preferred. The carriages were dark wood and brass, the windows framed in green velvet that had once been deep and rich and was now the particular faded colour of something that had been beautiful for a very long time. The lamp above Marion's seat swayed gently with the motion of the train, casting a warm amber circle on the page of the book she was not, in any meaningful sense, reading. She had been looking at the same paragraph for 40 minutes. She knew this because she had checked her watch when she first noticed that the words were not arriving in her mind in any coherent sequence, and she had checked it again 3 times since, not because she needed to know the time, but because the act of checking it gave her something to do with her hands. The watch had been her father's. It was heavier than ladies' watches were supposed to be, and she wore it on a chain that she had chosen herself, and she had carried it every day for 4 years, since the morning after the funeral, when she had found it on the hall table and understood that there was no one left to return it to. Outside the window, the last of the day was draining from the sky in long horizontal bands of colour, amber at the horizon, then a pale and tender gold, then a grey that deepened slowly toward blue as the eye moved upward. The fields beyond the glass were dark already, their shapes flattening into silhouettes of hedgerow and tree line, and the occasional dark bulk of a farmhouse, windows lit, smoke from chimneys rising in pale columns against the cooling sky. Marion watched all of this without quite deciding to watch it, in the way that the eye finds things to rest on when the mind is occupied elsewhere. She was 29 years old. She was a botanist, not in the way that ladies were sometimes called, botanists, meaning they pressed wildflowers and kept pleasant albums, but properly, academically, with publications in the Journal of the Linnean Society, and a correspondence with 3 separate professors at Oxford who had the good sense to engage with her ideas and the rather less admirable tendency to be surprised each time that the ideas were hers. She had short, dark hair, cut in a way that her Aunt Phyllis described as practical, and her former acquaintances in London described as eccentric, and which Marion herself described as convenient. She had grey eyes and a particular stillness about her that people often mistook for composure, and which was, in fact, merely attention. She had spent her childhood learning to pay attention to things, to the small variations in leaf shape that distinguished one species from another, to the way a plant adapted itself to its specific conditions of soil and light and moisture, and the habit had become so deeply ingrained that she applied it to everything, including people, including rooms, including the quality of light through train windows at dusk. She was going to Dunmore Hall. The letter had arrived 11 days ago, on a grey Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the stack of correspondence she always found waiting on her desk when she returned from the greenhouse. She had opened it last, after the letters from her publisher and the bill from the apothecary, and the note from Professor Ashby at Kew, because the handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, and she had learned, over years of managing her own affairs, that unfamiliar handwriting was usually either something unpleasant or something dull, and she preferred to fortify herself with the familiar before encountering either. The letter had been neither unpleasant nor dull. It had been, in its precise and careful way, one of the more unusual communications she had ever received. It was from a solicitor, a Mr. Elias Croft of Ludlow, writing on behalf of the estate of Sir Edmund Blackwell, recently deceased. Sir Edmund, the letter explained, with the particular careful efficiency of legal correspondence, had been a collector, not in the general, idle sense of a man who accumulates objects because he has the money and the space, in the specific, devoted sense of a man who had spent 40 years assembling what Mr. Croft described in slightly awed terms as one of the most comprehensive private botanical collections in England, herbarium specimens, watercolour studies, notebooks, correspondence with naturalists across 3 continents, a glasshouse that was said to contain species which had not been classified by any institution in the country. Sir Edmund had no family. His estate, Dunmore Hall, was to be held in trust while his collections were assessed, catalogued, and in due course donated to various institutions. The assessment required someone with genuine expertise. Mr. Croft had consulted Professor Ashby at Kew, who had consulted 2 colleagues, and the name that had emerged from these consultations, with, Marion gathered, some degree of discussion about whether a woman could be trusted with the task, discussion which she chose not to dwell on, was hers. She would be housed at Dunmore Hall for as long as the assessment required. The estate was still occupied by a small household staff who had remained on in the weeks since Sir Edmund's death. She would have full access to all collections, all rooms relevant to the botanical work and the library. There was a significant fee. There were detailed practical arrangements. There was, at the very end of the letter, a single sentence which Mr. Croft appeared to have added almost as an afterthought, or perhaps because he felt in some professional obligation to disclose it. I should mention that the Hall has been in somewhat unusual circumstances since Sir Edmund's death, and that you may find certain aspects of the household requiring some adjustment. He had not elaborated. Marion had read the sentence 3 times, found it entirely opaque, and written back accepting the commission. The train was slowing. Through the window, she could see the lights of a small station, the name board dim in the evening, and she leaned forward to read it. Dunmore Hall. She closed her book, which she had not read, and reached for her travelling bag. The platform was short and cold and almost entirely empty. A porter appeared from the shadow of a small stone building, took her trunk with the resigned efficiency of a man who has done this too many times to find it interesting, and pointed her toward the station entrance. Beyond the low fence, she could see a carriage waiting, a black shape against the dark, a horse standing with its head slightly lowered against the October chill. The driver was a broad-shouldered older man with a cap pulled down and a coat that had seen considerable weather. He did not smile when she approached, but he was not unfriendly either. He simply looked at her in the way of a person who has been sent to collect someone and is relieved to find that the someone has arrived. "Miss Hale," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, you're from Dunmore Hall." "Silas, I drive for the hall." He took her trunk and secured it with a practiced economy of movement. "It's 4 miles. Road is good tonight." Marion climbed into the carriage and settled against the seat, and as they pulled away from the small lit island of the station, she found herself in a darkness that was deeper and quieter than any she had experienced in London or in the towns and cities where she had spent most of her adult life. There were no street lamps. There was a moon 3/4 full, riding behind thin cloud, and by its diffused light she could make out the shapes of the lane they travelled. Trees on either side, their branches not yet bare, still holding the last of their October leaves in pale and rustling masses overhead. And beyond the trees, fields, and beyond the fields, the shapes of low hills against the sky. She was not a nervous person. She had travelled alone to Scotland, to the west of Ireland, to the mountains of Wales, to various corners of the continent, where interesting plants grew in inconvenient places. She was accustomed to arriving in unfamiliar places in the dark and making herself at home in them. But there was something about the quality of the silence in this Shropshire lane that she noticed without being able to immediately name. It was not threatening. It was simply very complete, as though the world had made a considered decision to be quiet for a while and was carrying it out with great thoroughness. After some time, she did not check her watch. The carriage turned through a gate, and the lane became a drive, and the drive was lined with beech trees whose trunks were silver grey in the moonlight. And at the end of the drive, Dunmore Hall appeared. It was large. She had expected large, given what the letter had told her about the collections, about the glasshouse, about the scope of Sir Edmund's life's work. But large was an inadequate word for the particular quality of the house as it presented itself at the end of that beech-lined drive. It was built of pale stone, limestone, she thought, from the local geology, and it was old, 2 wings stretching back from a central block, the whole thing perhaps 4 stories at its highest point, with tall windows that reflected the moonlight in long, pale rectangles. There were lights in several windows, not many, 5 or 6 points of warm amber against the dark stone facade, and the effect was not cheerful. Not unwelcoming, exactly, but not cheerful. The house looked like a place that was used to holding things, used to patience, used to the long, slow work of keeping. The carriage stopped at the front steps. Marion climbed out and stood for a moment, looking up at the house, the October air cold against her face, and felt she would not have been able to explain this if asked, and she was not the kind of person who spoke easily about feelings. A curious sense of recognition, as though she had been to this place before, not in any literal sense, but in the sense of having imagined it, or of having arrived somewhere she had been moving toward without knowing it. The front door opened, and light came out of it, warm and golden, and a woman appeared in the doorway. The woman in the doorway was perhaps 60, with silver hair arranged in a neat and uncompromising bun, and an expression that communicated, with impressive economy, that she had been managing large houses for a long time and had encountered most things that large houses could produce and found all of them, in the end, manageable. She wore a dark dress and a ring of keys at her waist, and she held a lamp with the easy authority of someone who has carried lamps through dark corridors so many times that a lamp has become simply an extension of the hand. Miss Hale, her voice was measured and warm, in the way of a person who has decided to be kind and means it as a policy rather than a performance. I am Mrs. Aldous. I keep the house. How do you do, Mrs. Aldous? I am very glad to have arrived. Come in, please. Silas will bring your trunk. There is supper laid in the small dining room, and I have prepared the blue room for you, which was always Sir Edmund's guest room, and is the most comfortable. The sheets were aired this afternoon. Marion stepped inside. The entrance hall of Dunmore Hall was the kind of space that declared, without particular drama, that it had been here for a very long time and intended to continue. The floor was stone flags, worn smooth and slightly hollowed in the places where feet had crossed them most often over 2 centuries. The walls were panelled in dark oak to shoulder height, and above that hung portraits, the accumulated faces of generations, most of them dark with age and varnish, their expressions ranging from stern to merely serious. A staircase rose from the far end of the hall, wide enough for 3 people abreast, with balusters of dark turned wood and a handrail worn to a deep shine. The ceiling was high and plastered, and in the lamplight showed the traces of decoration. A shallow relief of foliage and fruit that had been there, she guessed, for at least 150 years. It smelled of beeswax and old paper and cold stone and, underneath everything, very faintly, of something green and living, which he would later understand, came from the glasshouse, whose air drifted in small currents through certain parts of the house, even when its doors were closed. The collections are on the upper floors, Mrs. Aldous said, moving toward the staircase with the lamp, and in the east room on the ground floor, which Sir Edmund used as his study. The glass house is through the orangery. I will show you everything tomorrow. Tonight you should eat and rest. Yes, thank you. Marion followed her up the stairs. How long was Sir Edmund ill? Mrs. Aldous paused for a fraction of a moment, the way someone pauses when they are deciding how much to say. Several months. He did not say so, but we knew. He spent every day in the collections until he could not. He made arrangements. He was— Another small pause. A very particular man. Very thorough. The letter from Mr. Croft mentioned that the household had been in unusual circumstances. He was not very specific. Mrs. Aldous turned at the landing and looked at her. The lamp made amber shadows in the angles of her face, and her expression was steady and clear. Sir Edmund left instructions, she said, about the house, about certain rooms, about— she seemed to select her words with care— the way things are kept. I see, said Marion, who did not quite. You will understand more when you have been here a few days, Mrs. Aldous said, and turned to continue up the stairs. The west wing is not currently in use. I ask that you do not go into the west wing without speaking to me first. There is no danger in it, she added, with the brisk precision of someone who anticipates the obvious concern. But Sir Edmund had reasons for keeping it as it is, and until Mr. Croft has made his assessments, those reasons stand. "Of course," said Marion. "The blue room was at the front of the house on the first floor, and it was named, she saw immediately, for its curtains and its coverlet, which were a deep and somewhat faded blue. The room was large and simply furnished. A wide bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk by the window, a fireplace in which a fire had been laid and lit and was burning with a steady and comfortable warmth. There was a washstand with a blue and white ewer, and on the desk someone had placed a candle in a brass holder and a small vase of late-season flowers, rose hips, dried seed heads, a few sprigs of something lavender-coloured that Marion bent to examine and identified as wild thyme. She straightened up and felt, with some surprise, the specific pleasure of a room that has been prepared with attention. "The bathroom is 2 doors down the corridor," Mrs. Aldous said. "Breakfast is at 8. But if you wish to begin your work before then, I will have something sent to the study. The staff here are myself, Silas, Agnes, who cooks, and Thomas, who does the garden and the heavier work. We are a small household. Sir Edmund preferred it. And you have all stayed on since his death." "We have. He asked us to. Until the estate is settled." She set the lamp on the writing desk and moved toward the door. "I will have your supper sent up tonight, Miss Hale. I imagine you are tired from the journey." "That is very kind." Mrs. Aldous paused at the door. She looked at Marion with an expression that was careful and, beneath the carefulness, something else, something that Marion filed away as, "This person wants to say something and is deciding whether to say it." Then she appeared to decide not to, and the expression settled back into its professional warmth. "Sleep well," she said. "The house is very quiet at night." When she had gone, Marion stood in the middle of the blue room and looked around it in the way she always did when she arrived somewhere new, methodically, thoroughly, beginning at one point and moving around the space in order, the way you look at something when you want to understand it rather than merely see it. The walls, the ceiling, the window, which she crossed to and looked out of, seeing below her the front drive and the beech trees, and beyond them, dark fields and the shapes of low hills under the moon. The desk, the fireplace, the wardrobe, which she opened and found empty, its interior smelling of cedar and thyme. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, there was a small framed watercolour. She lifted her lamp and looked at it closely. It was a botanical study, a single plant, rendered with great precision, the roots as carefully detailed as the flowers. The plant was one she recognized, Digitalis purpurea, foxglove, painted in the full extravagance of its summer flowering. The tall spike of purple-spotted bells shone against a background of soft green. It was a beautiful piece of work. Someone had written in pencil at the bottom, in a small and careful hand, "Dunmore Wood, June 1861, 26 years ago." She wondered who had made it. She ate her supper, cold pheasant and bread and a slice of very good apple tart, and a glass of cider that was drier and more interesting than she had expected, at the desk by the window. And she looked out at the dark and the moon and thought about the west, wing, and the particular quality of Mrs. Aldous' careful words. And then she undressed and got into the bed, which was warm and deep and had the specific smell of linen that has been thoroughly aired. And she listened to the quiet of Dunmore Hall. It was, as Mrs. Aldous had said, very quiet. But it was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a house that is full of things. Things in cases and drawers and on shelves and in notebooks piled on shelves. Things that have been arranged and kept and cared for over a very long life, and which are now waiting, with the particular patience of objects, to see what will happen next. She fell asleep more quickly than she expected. Her last conscious thought was the smell of something green and faintly humid, the breath of the glasshouse finding its way through the old walls of the house and into her room. And it was not an unpleasant thing to fall asleep to. She was awake before dawn. This was not unusual for her. She had spent enough mornings in the field, waiting for the light to be good enough to see clearly, or simply restless with the particular restlessness of someone who finds the hours before sunrise the most useful ones, that her body had learned over time not to waste them on sleep. She dressed in the dark, lit her candle from the banked embers of the fire, and sat at the desk by the window and watched the sky above the Shropshire hills turn from black to the colour of old pewter, then to a pale and wintry rose, then finally to the flat grey-white of an October morning. She had brought her own notebooks. She always brought her own notebooks, small ones with heavy paper and a system of her own devising for cross-referencing observations. And she spent the first hour writing down what she had observed so far, which was not much, but she found it useful to begin this way, to establish the habit of notation before the work proper began. The view from the window, the smell of the house, the foxglove watercolour on the mantelpiece, the particular way Mrs. Aldous had said West Wing, which was the way one mentions something that one has decided to mention as little as possible. At 7, she went down. The house was very still. In the kitchen passage, she found Agnes, a stout woman of perhaps 50, who was making bread with the absorbed focus of someone who has made bread every morning for 30 years and finds the repetition not tedious, but meditative. Agnes said good morning in a flat Shropshire accent and asked if Miss Hale would like tea, and Marion said yes, and sat at the kitchen table while Agnes made it, and they were companionable in the silence of people who have both been up for a long time and don't need to fill early morning with words. Mrs. Aldous appeared at 7:30 and offered to show Marion the study after breakfast. They ate in the small dining room, eggs and toast and the remains of the previous evening's cold pheasant, which Marion ate without difficulty. And then Mrs. Aldous produced a key from her ring and led Marion to the east side of the ground floor. The study had been Sir Edmund's primary working space for, Mrs. Aldous said, pushing the door open, more than 30 years. It was immediately apparent that this was true. The room had the quality of a space that has been inhabited so thoroughly and for so long that it has ceased to be merely a room and has become an extension of the person who occupied it. The smell was extraordinary. Paper and ink and the sharp green note of dried plant matter, and beneath that, something darker and earthier, the smell of soil brought in on boots and specimens, and the particular rich scent of a life spent close to the natural world. The desk was large and faced the window, which looked out onto the walled garden, and its surface was covered completely in the careful disorder of someone who knows exactly where everything is, with notebooks, loose papers, specimen folders, hand lenses, small glass vials of seeds, dried specimens pressed flat between sheets of blotting paper, watercolor studies pinned directly to the wooden surface. Behind the desk, all four walls were shelved from floor to ceiling, and the shelves were full. Notebooks, hundreds of them, she saw immediately, the spines labelled in Sir Edmund's small, careful hand. Folders, larger volumes, floras, taxonomic references, monographs, and on the highest shelves, below the ceiling, row upon row of specimen boxes of the type used for herbarium collections. The lids labelled, the whole arrangement dusty on top and clean on the front, which suggested that they had been consulted so frequently that the dust had never had a chance to settle on the parts that hands could reach. Marion stood in the doorway and looked at all of this for a moment without saying anything. He worked in here every day, Mrs. Aldous said, until the last 6 weeks. He left a catalogue, a partial, on the desk. He knew he would not finish it himself. I think he hoped someone would come who could understand it. Marion stepped into the room. She picked up one of the notebooks from the desk, gently, with the habitual care of someone who handles fragile things, and opened it. The handwriting inside was small and precise and entirely legible, the observations detailed and exact and annotated with the kind of cross-references that indicated a mind accustomed to thinking in networks, in connections, in the long chains of relationship that link one species to another across centuries of adaptation. She read 2 pages without stopping. Then she put the notebook down and looked up. How many? She asked. The notebooks, approximately. He counted them once, about 4 years ago. He told me there were more than 800. 800. She looked at the shelves again. She had known in the abstract from the solicitor's letter that this was a significant collection. She had not, until this moment, felt the full weight of what significant meant in practice. And the specimens themselves, in the glasshouse. I don't know the number. He always said he had lost count. A small pause. I can show you the glasshouse whenever you are ready. Yes, said Marion. But first, may I sit here, at the desk? I would like to read the catalogue. Mrs. Aldous looked at her. Again that quality of careful assessment, and then something behind it that Marion filed as relief. Of course, Mrs. Aldous said. This is your room now, for as long as the work takes. I will have tea sent at 10. She left, closing the door behind her with a quiet click, and Marion sat in Sir Edmund Blackwell's chair, at Sir Edmund Blackwell's desk, and pulled the partial catalogue toward her, and began to read. She was still reading 3 hours later, when Mrs. Aldous sent Agnes with the tea. The catalogue was extraordinary. It was not, in the conventional sense, a complete record. Sir Edmund had been right that he would not finish it, had clearly known this for some time, and the final entries trailed off in a way that suggested increasing difficulty of writing. The letters slightly larger and less precise than the early entries, the sentences shorter. But what was there was meticulous. He had recorded not just the specimens themselves, but their provenance, where they had been found, when, by whom, the conditions under which they grew, their relationships to other species in the same habitat, the state of their populations in the places he had observed them. In many entries, There were notes that went beyond taxonomy into something closer to natural history, observations about the behavior of insects around certain flowers, the way particular plants responded to specific combinations of soil chemistry and altitude and light. It was the work of a man who had spent 40 years paying very close, very loving attention, and who had understood by the end that the attention itself was the thing. She drank her tea without tasting it and turned pages and felt the particular feeling she always felt when encountering a great collection of careful work. The feeling of suddenly being in the presence of a mind, not an abstract mind, but a specific one, a person who had thought these thoughts in this order and made these connections and noticed these particular things, who had sat at this desk and looked out at that walled garden and understood something about the world that she was now, slowly, beginning to follow. Sir Edmund Blackwell had been dead for 6 weeks. She had never met him. She had no picture of him in her mind except the one the catalogue was assembling for her, piece by piece, page by page. A man of great patience, great particularity, great love for the small and overlooked and precise. A man who had found something early in his life that was worth every hour he gave to it, and had given it all of them. At noon she closed the catalogue and sat back and looked at the walled garden through the study window. The light was thin and October pale, falling flat and clean across the garden beds, which were mostly cleared of their summer growth, but still showed here and there the dark stems of things not yet cut back, the skeletal architecture of plants past their season. In the far corner of the garden, she could see the roof of the glasshouse, or rather, the top of it, a long, low structure of iron and glass that caught the flat light and threw it back in a cool gleam. She would go there tomorrow. Today, she needed more of the catalogue. She picked up her pen and her own notebook and began to write. She was still writing when the light began to fail at 3:30, and she lit the desk lamp and went on. And when Mrs. Aldous came at 5 to ask whether she would take dinner in the small dining room or in the study, she looked up with a slightly unfocused expression of someone surfacing from deep water and chose the study and ate her dinner at the desk surrounded by Sir Edmund's notebooks, and felt, in a way she had not expected to feel so quickly, entirely at home. The glasshouse was reached through the orangery, as Mrs. Aldous had said, and the orangery itself was worth a moment's pause. It occupied the full southern face of the house's east wing, a long room with flagged floors and whitewashed walls, and a ceiling of wrought iron and glass that had been installed, Mrs. Aldous told her, in the 1830s by Sir Edmund's father, who had been passionate about citrus and had maintained a collection of potted orange and lemon trees that filled the room every winter with a scent that, according to Mrs. Aldous, who had been at Dunmore Hall since she was 22, was the closest thing to summer that the house had in January. The trees were still there, large and old, and planted in their massive terracotta pots, their dark, glossy leaves pressing against the glass of the ceiling, a few late fruit still hanging among them like small orange lanterns in the October grey. Beyond the orangery, through a door of iron and glass set in the stone wall, was the glasshouse, and here Marion stopped walking and simply stood and breathed and looked. It was large, longer than the orangery, considerably taller, the roof rising to a ridge perhaps 20 feet above the flagged floor. And it was warm, a warmth that was not the warmth of fire or hearth, but the specific warmth of growing things, the warmth of photosynthesis, of green life in enclosed and tended space. The humidity was considerable. She could feel it on her face immediately, a soft and welcome heaviness after the cold and dry of the October morning. She breathed in and smelled everything, earth and water and chlorophyll, and the deep, complicated sweetness of tropical flowers, and the sharper, green note of ferns, and the rich, dark underpinning of composted soil. The plants were everywhere. This was perhaps the most immediate impression. Not that there were many plants, though there were hundreds, but that they were everywhere, filling the space from floor to glass, occupying every possible position with the particular democratic indifference of things that do not recognize the human concept of order. There were low beds of ferns along the walls, their fronds layered in deep greens from near black to almost yellow. There were benches of orchids, dozens of species, their flowers ranging from the common to the genuinely strange, forms she recognized and forms she did not, shapes that seemed to have arrived at their particular solutions to the problem of attracting pollinators by routes she could not immediately follow. There were climbers on iron frames that rose to the full height of the roof, a passiflora with its alien geometry of flowers, a Hoya with its waxy clusters, something she did not recognize immediately, that had leaves as large as her head and was putting out, even in October, small white flowers with a perfume that reached her from 3 feet away. There was a central path through the glasshouse, flagged like the orangery floor, and she walked it slowly, stopping often, bending to examine things, pulling her notebook from her pocket, and beginning to write almost immediately. This was what she was here for. This was the work. But she was also, more than she generally allowed herself to be in working hours, simply moved, because this was clearly as anything she'd ever looked at, the work of a lifetime of love. Not just expertise, not just diligence, but the accumulated attention of a person who had cared deeply and consistently and over decades about these specific things. Many of the plants were labeled with small handwritten cards on metal stakes. She bent to read them. The labels gave the species name, the family, the country of origin, the date of acquisition, and often a brief note. Purchased from a collection in Edinburgh, 1869, or received as seed from Dr. Müller in Frankfurt, 1874, or found growing on the edge of Dunmore Wood, July 1882. Locality not previously recorded in Shropshire. That last one she read twice. A species found in the estate's own woodland, locally significant, possibly undescribed in the county. She wrote it down carefully. At the far end of the glasshouse, beyond a group of large palms that partly screened the view, there was a small area that was set apart from the rest. A bench, iron, with a cushion on it, old and somewhat faded. A low table beside the bench with a reading stand on it, the kind used for large books. And on the table, beside the reading stand, a single dried foxglove head in a plain glass jar, its seeds still intact in their split capsules. The whole thing pale and skeletal and beautiful in the way that things in their last stage are sometimes beautiful. Marion sat down on the bench. She had not meant to sit down. She had meant to go on walking the glasshouse and taking notes. But she sat down and looked at the foxglove head in the jar and thought about the watercolour in her room, Dunmore Wood, June 1861, and felt the presence of a person who was not there. Sir Edmund had sat here many times, perhaps every day, surrounded by everything he had spent his life assembling, in the warmth and the green-scented air, reading or thinking or simply sitting the way that people sit when they are content and at home. She wondered what he had thought about. She wondered whether he had been lonely. She wondered who had painted the foxglove and why he had hung the painting in the guest room rather than keeping it where he worked. She did not sit for long. She was not the sitting kind, but she sat long enough, and then she stood and took out her notebook and began methodically from the bench to record everything in her field of vision. She spent 4 hours in the glass house that first day and went back at dusk after dinner to make sure she had not missed anything she needed to note before the light failed entirely. When she finally came in through the orangery, her fingers were cold despite the warmth she had been working in all afternoon. The glasshouse temperature dropped quickly in October evenings, even with the stove that she had found burning at the far end of the central path. And she had filled 12 pages of her notebook and had the satisfying tiredness of a body that has been used fully and well. Mrs. Aldous was in the entrance hall with a lamp when Marion came through from the orangery passage. "The west wing," Marion said, without quite deciding to say it. Mrs. Aldous looked at her. "You asked me not to go in without speaking to you. I am speaking to you." A pause. Mrs. Aldous held her lamp and looked at Marion with the expression of someone making a decision. "Not tonight," she said at last. "But I think, yes, tomorrow evening, after your work. There is something there that I believe you should see." "What sort of something?" "The sort that requires the right time and the right light," Mrs. Aldous said, in a tone that closed the subject with great gentleness. "Good night, Miss Hale." Marion went to bed with the smell of the glass house still in her hair and the question of the west wing sitting in the back of her mind like a lamp left burning in a distant room, visible but not yet close enough to see by. It rained for 3 days. Not violently, not the storm-driven rain of dramatic weather, but the patient, persistent rain of October in the English countryside, rain that falls straight down in a fine and comprehensive curtain and does not hurry and does not particularly intend to stop. Marion barely noticed. She worked in the study from early morning to midday, reading the catalogue and cross-referencing it with the notebooks on the shelves, building in her own notebook a map of the collection, its structure, its gaps, its particularly significant specimens. In the afternoons, she went to the glasshouse, where the rain on the glass made a sound like someone running their fingers along a long keyboard, soft and continuous and deeply soothing. She was learning Sir Edmund's system. Every collector develops a system over time, a way of organizing their material that reflects both the material and the mind that has assembled it. And Sir Edmund's system was elegant and logical, and had one feature that she had not expected. It was arranged not taxonomically, as most herbaria were, by family and genus and species in the standard scientific order, but ecologically. The specimens were organized by habitat: woodland, hedgerow, meadow, wetland, moorland, and so on. with the glasshouse collections arranged by the regions of the world from which they had come. The effect was that when you moved through the collection, you were moving through landscapes rather than through classification systems, and the relationships between species were the relationships of place rather than the relationships of botanical family. It was, she thought, a more honest way of showing how plants actually lived. She said this to no one, because there was no one to say it to, except in the evenings when she sat with Mrs. Aldous in the small sitting room after dinner, and they talked about the house and the collection, and gradually about Sir Edmund himself. Mrs. Aldous had been at Dunmore for 38 years. She had arrived as an under-housekeeper at the age of 22 and had risen to her current position by the time she was 35, when the previous housekeeper retired. She had known Sir Edmund for the entire length of her time there, and had, in the careful and professional sense of a housekeeper who has spent decades managing the household of a person she respected, understood him better than most people had. He was not a sociable man, Mrs. Aldous said on the second evening of rain, with a mug of cocoa she had made for both of them, which Marion found unexpectedly touching. Not unfriendly, never unfriendly, but very self-contained. He preferred the company of his work to most company. He had his correspondence, his colleagues, the occasional visiting naturalist, but he was always relieved when visitors left. He never married. He was engaged once, very briefly, when he was young, before my time. Thomas, the gardener, knew him then. He would not say much about it. A small pause, during which Mrs. Aldous held her mug with both hands and looked at the fire. There was a sister. She was here for many years. She died. Oh, it must be 15 years ago now. He was very quiet after that, more so than before. The watercolour in my room, Marion said. The foxglove, Dunmore Wood, 1861. Did she paint it? Mrs. Aldous looked at her. How did you know it was hers? I didn't, I guessed. The style is different from the other botanical studies I've seen in the study and the catalogue. Those are precise, scientific. The foxglove painting is precise, but it's also, she paused, trying to find the word, affectionate. Her name was Catherine, Mrs. Aldous said. She was a gifted artist. Sir Edmund's collections include many of her studies. The watercolours in the upper corridor, the series in the East Library. He catalogued them with the same care as the botanical specimens. She set down her mug. He was a man who loved deeply and expressed it primarily by keeping things safe. Marion thought about this for some time after she'd gone to bed. She lay in the dark with the rain on the windows and thought about a man who had spent 40 years assembling a monument to attention. Notebooks upon notebooks of careful observation, a glass house full of things brought from the far corners of the world and tended with daily care. And she thought about his sister painting foxgloves in the wood in June of 1861, and she thought about the foxglove head in the jar by the bench where he used to sit, and she understood that the collection and the man were not two things, but one thing, and that to understand what he had built, she would need to understand what he had loved. On the third day of rain, she found in the back of one of the study's lower drawers a small packet of letters tied with faded green ribbon. The packet was not labelled. She held it for a moment and then put it back exactly where it had been, without opening it. Those were not for her. But the fact of them, a packet of letters kept in the back of a drawer for years, perhaps decades, added something to the picture she was assembling. By the end of the third day, she had read 400 pages of catalogue and made detailed notes on 67 specimens of particular significance, and she had a preliminary sense of what the collection was and what it would require. It would take months, not the weeks she had perhaps optimistically imagined when she had written back to Mr. Croft. It would take through the winter and into the spring, possibly beyond. She would need to write to him about this and to the friends in London who were expecting her back before Christmas, and to the editor at the journal who was expecting a paper in January. She was aware, forming these letters in her mind, of a curious absence of reluctance. She had expected to feel at some point the particular tug of the city, the library at the Linnean Society, the shops on Tottenham Court Road, where she bought her notebooks, the evenings with a small circle of colleagues and friends who were the fabric of her London life. She did not feel it. What she felt, sitting at Sir Edmund's desk with the rain on the window and the 800 notebooks ranked behind her, and the smell of the glasshouse coming faintly through the walls, was something closer to the feeling of having been given unexpectedly exactly the right amount of time. On the evening of the third day, the rain stopped, and the sky cleared to a darkness so full of stars that she stood at her bedroom window for 10 minutes, looking at it before she remembered that she was going to bed. "Now," said Mrs. Aldous the following evening, appearing in the doorway of the study at 4 o'clock with a lamp, although there was still sufficient light in the October sky for Marion to see by. "If you have finished for the day." Marion looked up from the notebook she had been writing in. She had been, in fact, finished for perhaps 20 minutes, but had continued writing because she was in the middle of a thought and did not want to lose it. She capped her pen and closed the notebook and stood. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." Mrs. Aldous led her not through the main entrance hall, but through a back passage and up a secondary staircase that Marion had noticed but not yet explored. A narrower stair, plainly carpeted, the kind used by household staff, which brought them out onto the first floor of the west wing. Here the corridor was different from the east side of the house. The carpet was the same, but the air was cooler, the light more dim, the smell of the house more concentrated, more layered, as though the west wing held a denser version of what the rest of the house breathed. "The rooms at this end are storage," Mrs. Aldous said, moving down the corridor. "Furniture, trunks. They haven't been used in the ordinary way for many years. But this room at the end, this is what I wanted to show you." The room at the end of the west wing corridor was large. Its windows faced west, and the evening light came through them at a low angle, catching the dust motes in the air and making them briefly visible. Countless small particles drifting in the long shafts of amber light. It took a moment for Marion's eyes to adjust to the particular quality of the illumination and to understand what she was seeing. The room was Catherine's studio. It had been kept exactly as she had left it, not cleaned out, not converted to another purpose, not stripped of its contents, simply preserved. The long table under the west windows still held her equipment, The water jars now empty and dry, their insides stained with the faint traces of colour. The brushes in their pot, their tips perfectly clean. The palettes laid out, their paint dried to a translucent film. On the easel in the corner, a painting unfinished. A study of something Marion could not immediately identify. A watercolour of a plant in an early stage of completion. The pencil lines still visible under the wash, the subject blocked in but not yet fully realized. On the walls, studies, dozens of them, pinned and framed, covering the walls so completely that the wallpaper was almost invisible behind them. Everyone a plant, everyone made with the same quality of hand she had recognized in the foxglove, precise and affectionate at once, scientifically rigorous in his observation and unmistakably personal in his making, as though the painter had found in botanical illustration the perfect form for expressing something for which there was no other language. The style was consistent but not monotonous. She had grown as an artist over the years these studies represented. The early ones somewhat simpler, the later ones increasingly confident and complex, the relationship between observer and observed deepening over time into something that had the quality of long acquaintance, of genuine mutual knowledge. Marion moved slowly around the room, looking. She spent a long time in front of a large study of an orchid, one of the species from the glasshouse, she thought, a dactylohyosa of some kind, which occupied the central position on the longest wall and had been executed with a care that bordered on devotion, the individual flowers rendered with a delicacy that suggested hours of patient looking, the root system as carefully observed as the bloom. He kept it like this, she said, from the day she died. Mrs. Aldous said from the doorway. He came in here every year on her birthday, and on the day she died, he dusted everything himself. He would not let anyone else in, or very rarely. He asked me once toward the end to show it to whoever came to do the work on his collection. He said, she stopped. What did he say? He said the collections and Catherine's work were the same work, that they had grown together and couldn't be understood apart. A small pause. He was right. She spent 30 years drawing the things he collected. He spent 30 years collecting the things she drew. It was a collaboration of the deepest kind. Marion looked at the unfinished painting on the easel. Up close, she could see what it was. A helleborus, one of the winter flowering species she had identified in the glasshouse. Catherine had been working on it in November or December of whatever year she had died. She had got the leaves exactly right. The dark, leathery surface, the subtle variation in green, and had begun the flowers, but only begun. The flowers were sketched and blocked with the first wash of colour, their forms suggested but not completed, waiting for a hand that would not return. She turned away from it after a moment. Some things you could not look at for too long. They went back down the secondary stair in silence. In the entrance hall, Mrs. Aldous paused. I thought, she said carefully, that you might want to include her work in your assessment, in the catalogue of what is here. Yes, Marion said. I will. Good. Mrs. Aldous looked at her with an expression that was, for a moment, very direct. He would have been glad of that. He would have been glad, I think, of you. Marion did not say anything. She went to dinner, and after dinner she sat by the fire in the small sitting room and tried to read and could not. because she kept thinking about the orchid study on the longest wall and the unfinished hellebore on the easel, and the way a life's work can contain another life's work inside it, the way two kinds of attention to the same world can grow so thoroughly entwined that they become, in the end, one thing. She went to bed early and slept deeply, and did not dream, or did not remember dreaming. November arrived quietly. The beeches along the drive lost their leaves with a particular Shropshire slowness, shedding them in ones and twos, the ground beneath them deepening gradually from brown to gold to the dark, wet mat of November's end. The light in the study changed, flatter, more diffuse, the days shorter, so that she sometimes worked by lamp from 3 o'clock onward. The walled garden was grey and stripped back, the frost-blackened remains of summer growth cut down by Thomas, who came to it each day with a wheelbarrow and a systematic patience that she observed from the study window and found oddly comforting. She had fallen into a rhythm, the kind of rhythm that belongs specifically to long, solitary, absorbing work, a rhythm that has its own logic, its own internal structure, independent of the rhythms of the social world. She rose early, worked through the morning, took her noon meal in the study or in the glasshouse, worked through the afternoon, walked in the walled garden or on the drive in the brief interlude before the light failed, had dinner with Mrs. Aldous occasionally, and alone more often, read in the evenings, slept. She had begun to know the notebooks, 843 of them she had counted now. Sir Edmund had undercounted slightly in his final estimate, perhaps because by then the effort of counting had become too great. The earliest dated from 1843, when he had been 18 years old, and the last from September of the year he died, less than 2 months before the end. She was working through them in order, which was not necessarily the most efficient way to build the catalogue, but was, she had decided, the most honest. To read them in order was to follow a mind through time, to see what it noticed and how it changed and how it did not change. And this seemed to her important, more important than efficiency. The thing that struck her most, reading through the decades, was the constancy, not sameness. He had learned and changed and deepened considerably over 40 years of observation, but constancy in the particular quality of attention he brought to whatever he was looking at. He had noticed things at 70 that he had noticed at 20, and had noticed throughout all the years in between, and the noticing had never become routine. There was no sense, in any of the notebooks, of a mind going through motions it had rehearsed too many times. There was always, even in the briefest entries, a quality of freshness. This plant, this day, this light, this discovery, that seemed to her one of the finest things a person could achieve. She wrote this in her own notebook on a grey November afternoon, and then sat back and looked at what she had written and thought about freshness as an achievement rather than an accident. She was 29 years old. She had been paying careful attention to plants since she was 8, when her father had shown her how to use a hand lens, and she had seen, for the first time, the interior of a flower, the extraordinary machinery of stamen and pistil and petal, the perfect engineering of something that had been arrived at not by design, but by millions of years of slow, incremental change, and had understood that the world was considerably more interesting than she had previously imagined. 21 years of looking carefully. She wondered if she would still be finding it fresh in 40 more. She thought she would. She thought that was what the notebooks were showing her, that it was possible, not given, not guaranteed, but possible for a person who chose it, who kept choosing it every day in every ordinary and extraordinary circumstance. On the 12th of November, Mr. Elias Croft arrived from Ludlow. He was a small, neat man of about 55, with a brown suit and rimless spectacles, and the particular quality of precision that long practice in legal matters develops in people who are naturally precise to begin with. He arrived mid-morning in a trap driven by his clerk, inspected the exterior of the house with a professional calm, and sat in the small dining room with Marion and Mrs. Aldous for an hour and a half while she explained her findings so far and outlined the scope of the remaining work. He listened with great attention and asked few questions, and made careful notes in a leather-bound pocketbook. When she had finished, he sat for a moment, looking at his notes. "Miss Hale," he said, "I want to say, I was not entirely certain when we engaged you that the scale of the task was fully apparent to all parties, including myself. Having heard your assessment, I believe the scope of what Sir Edmund left is larger than the estate's trustees fully understood." "Yes," she said, "it is." A pause. He looked at her over his spectacles. "I should also tell you, and I was somewhat remiss not to have mentioned this before, that Sir Edmund's will includes a provision for his botanical work specifically. There is a sum allocated for the proper cataloguing and preservation of the collection. It is larger than the fee we originally discussed, considerably larger. Sir Edmund was, well, he was very clear about what he wanted. What did he want? He wanted his collections preserved and made available to people who would use them, scholars, naturalists, students. He had very specific ideas about how that should be done." He paused again. "He also, I mention this as perhaps relevant, he read your work, your publications. He wrote to Professor Ashby about you approximately 18 months before he died. He said," he found the reference in his notes, "he said that Miss Hale writes about plants as though they matter, which is rarer than it ought to be." Marion sat very still for a moment. He did not know then, Mr. Croft continued carefully, that he would not be there to meet you, but I believe, from the nature of the instructions he left, that he would have, yes, I believe he would have been glad. It was the second time she had heard that phrase. She was glad for the business of tea and biscuits that followed, which gave her something to do with her hands and her face while she absorbed this information. Thomas was 71 years old and had worked in the gardens of Dunmore Hall since he was 17. This meant he had known Sir Edmund for 54 years, which was longer than anyone else alive had known him, and he bore this distinction with the easy, unsentimental matter-of-factness of a man who is accustomed to long-time spans, because he works in a medium, the garden, that operates on long-time spans. Marion had spoken to him in passing several times during her first weeks at Dunmore. Brief practical exchanges about which parts of the walled garden contained what, about the species in the outer beds, about the history of the kitchen garden. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly, but not inclined to elaboration, with large hands and a Shropshire accent so deep it sometimes required a moment's decoding. He moved through the garden with the slow certainty of a man who has walked the same paths every day for half a century and knows each of them the way most people know their own rooms. In mid-November, she asked him about Dunmore Wood. The wood was visible from the upper floor of the house, a broad and irregular block of ancient broadleaf woodland that occupied the southeastern corner of the estate, perhaps 30 acres. Its edge some quarter-mile from the house, across fields that Thomas's management had kept in rough grass. She had wanted to go there since the first morning she had seen it from her bedroom window. But the weather had not offered itself, and she had been absorbed in the study, and she had kept putting it off in the way one puts off things that require outdoor walking equipment and deliberate planning. "Tomorrow morning," Thomas said, when she asked whether he would show her the wood. He said it as a flat statement, with no particular inflection. Then he said, he went there every week, even when he was not well. He said the wood was the beginning of everything. What did he mean? Thomas considered this. He was dead-heading the last of the garden roses with a pair of shears, his movements rhythmic and precise, and he did not stop while he thought. He found something there, he said at last. When he was young, a plant, something unusual. That was how it began. He looked up at her briefly. He'll have written about it. In the notebooks. He wrote about everything. She looked it up that evening. The earliest notebook, 1843. He had been 18 years old. She found the entry on the car, 3rd page, dated June the 7th. Went into the southwood this morning before breakfast. Found in the clearing by the old oak a colony of what I believe to be Neotia nidus avis, bird's nest orchid, though the colony is considerably larger than any I have seen described, and is growing in conditions somewhat different from those typically noted. I have never before seen this species. I have never before experienced the feeling of finding something in the world that seemed not to know it should be unusual. She put down the notebook and thought about an 18-year-old boy in a wood before breakfast, kneeling in the leaf mould by an old oak tree, finding a colony of bird's nest orchids, a plant so unusual in its biology, parasitic on the underground fungi of the woodland, growing with no chlorophyll and no need of light, its pale and ghostly flowers rising from the dark soil like something made of bone, and understanding in that moment what the rest of his life would be about. She had had her own moment. She was 8, and the hand lens, and the interior of a flower. But the feeling he had described, that thing of finding something in the world that seemed not to know it, should be unusual. She knew that feeling. She had known it dozens of times in the years since she was 8, and it was still the best feeling she was aware of, the one that made everything else, all the difficulty and frustration and uncertainty of a life spent studying things most people paid no attention to, worthwhile, not as a consolation, but as a justification, as a reason clear enough to require no argument. The next morning, Thomas took her to the wood. They walked across the fields in the November light, a light that was thin and pale and came from low in the south, casting long shadows from every fence post and tussock of grass. Thomas walked ahead with the steady pace of a man who has made this particular journey very many times, his boots dark with dew, a skye, brown coat and a cap. Marion walked behind him and felt the cold on her face and breathed the morning air and thought of nothing much. The wood was different from what she had seen of it at a distance. From the house, it had looked compact and dark, a block of tree cover. From inside, it was all variation. The high, pale trunks of beech and ash, the lower, more crooked arms of oak and hazel, the ground between them, a deep mat of last year's leaves, still golden brown in places, the underlying soil dark and rich. The light came through the leafless canopy in a diffuse, silvery way, casting no real shadows, illuminating everything equally in the flat, clean way of winter woodland light. Thomas led her without hesitation to the clearing by the old oak. She would have known the oak without his guidance, she thought. It was enormous, its trunk more than 6 feet across, its major limbs as thick as lesser trees. The whole thing, in its leafless November state, a magnificent architecture of dark wood against the pale sky. The clearing around its base was perhaps 20 feet across. The ground below it, a soft and particular leaf mold. The pH and moisture and fungal content, all specific to this exact spot. The conditions that a bird's nest orchid colony needed. She crouched and looked at the ground. In November, there was nothing to see of the orchids themselves. They were underground, in the mycorrhizal darkness where they spent most of their lives. But she knew what to look for. The slight raised texture of the soil where they grew, the particular darkness in one corner of the clearing. "They're here," she said. Thomas crouched beside her. His knees made a sound. "Every year," he said. He came in June to see them. Every year for 50 years. A small pause. When he was too ill to walk, he sent me to look and describe them to him. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not a man for words. I did my best." Marion looked at him. His face was weathered and still, his eyes on the dark corner of soil where the orchids were sleeping their winter sleep. She understood that he was telling her something more than the facts of it. "I'm sure you did well," she said. He nodded once and stood, and they walked back through the wood in the particular, companionable silence of two people who have briefly and without intention arrived at something true together and do not need to discuss it. December came and brought with it a cold that was the specific cold of an English country house in winter, a cold that was not the violent cold of frost and wind, but the deep, settled cold of stone walls that have spent the short days surrendering whatever warmth the weak winter sun had managed to give them, so that by evening every room that was not actively heated had the temperature and quality of a church. Marion wore an extra layer in the mornings and kept the study fire burning all day and developed the habit, which she suspected Mrs. Aldous had anticipated, of sitting as close to it as was compatible with being able to read her notebook without scorching it. The work deepened as she went on. She was now in the middle decades of the notebooks, the 1860s and 1870s, and the writing in them had changed, had opened up, the observations becoming more wide-ranging, the connections being made across broader distances of time and ecology and geography, the handwriting itself more settled and more confident. She could hear in these notebooks a mind reaching the full extent of what it was capable of, not its limits, but its reach, the full span of what a person could attend to and understand and connect when they had been doing it for 20 or 30 years and had not lost the capacity for surprise. She read about plants she knew well and plants she had never encountered. She read about a collecting expedition to the Atlas Mountains in 1869, conducted with a colleague from the Alpine Club, whose name recurred throughout the decade's notebooks and then disappeared abruptly in 1871 without explanation. She read about a period in 1873 when Sir Edmund had been ill. He mentioned it only in passing, a few weeks away from the notebooks, and then resuming as though no interruption had occurred. She read about Catherine, who appeared throughout the 1860s entries with a frequency that made clear how central she was to his daily life. Catherine painted the Helleborus this morning. Catherine's study of the dactylohyza is better than anything in the published monographs. Showed Catherine the bee orchid colony on the East Meadow, and she was up at 6 the next morning to begin a study. A portrait of a collaboration so natural and so apparently happy that its ending, which came in the early 1870s, had the quality of an amputation. After Catherine's death, the notebooks did not stop. They continued with the same precision and the same breadth of attention. But something had changed in their texture, not diminished exactly, but more solitary, more inward. He had kept working, he had kept noticing, but the thing that Catherine's presence had given to the notebooks, a sense of shared world, of looking at things together, was gone, and in its absence the notebooks had the quality of letters written to someone who cannot receive them. She thought of the packet in the drawer, tied with green ribbon, and did not touch it. On a Thursday evening in mid-December, she was working late in the glasshouse, checking a series of specimens against catalogue entries and making corrections, when she became aware that it was snowing. Not dramatically, it had begun quietly, as the light failed, and she had not noticed until she looked up at the glass above her and saw the white specks accumulating on the other side, making a soft and continuous sound as they settled on the glass roof. She put down her notebook and simply listened for a moment. Snow on a glass roof of a Victorian glasshouse, heard from inside. It was one of the specific pleasures of her work, she thought. The kind of thing that cannot be anticipated or planned, that arrives as a gift of circumstance. She walked the length of the glasshouse slowly, not looking at the plants, but at the glass above and around her, at the snow accumulating on every horizontal surface, softening the lines of the iron frame, building up along the ridge until the whole structure was edged in white. The plants around her were indifferent to all of it, the orchids going on with their orchid business, the ferns maintaining their deep green composure, the great climbing vine at the far end putting out its small white flowers with complete seasonal independence. She sat on the bench at the far end, by the reading stand with the empty foxglove jar. The stove nearby ticked and settled. The snow fell silently on the glass above her. The warmth and the green smell of the glasshouse enclosed her. She'd been here for 10 weeks. She had filled 62 pages of her own notebooks and had produced a preliminary catalogue of 431 specimens, with, she estimated, 400 more to go. She had read 206 of Sir Edmund's notebooks and had 237 ahead of her. She had begun in the evenings in the West Wing studio with a lamp to inventory Catherine's work. 114 studies catalogued of an estimated 300 total, each one recorded with the same care she applied to the botanical specimens, because Mrs. Aldous and Mr. Croft and Sir Edmund himself had all agreed that they were the same work. She was not lonely. This was worth noting because she was someone who, in London, was occasionally lonely in the way of a person who has sufficient friends and a sufficient social life, but finds at intervals that neither of these adequately addresses a particular quality of solitude that comes from spending most of one's time in intellectual work that is by its nature individual. Here she was not lonely because she was not alone. She was, in some way she could not quite explain and had not tried to explain to anyone, in very good company. After a time she took out her own notebook and wrote a few lines, not notes about the collection, just, "The snow is settling on the glass above the glasshouse, and I can hear it, and the stove is warm, and the orchids are in bloom, and I am, in a way that has surprised me, entirely content." She read this back. Then she added, "I think this is what he felt here. I think this is what he meant by everything beginning in the wood." She closed the notebook and sat for a while longer in the warmth, and then went in through the orangery and along the passage and up the stairs to the blue room, and slept through the snow falling softly on the Shropshire countryside, and did not wake until morning. January was long and pale and deeply quiet. The snow that had fallen in December persisted through most of the month, lying in the fields in the flat, clean way of snow that has settled fully and has no particular intention of leaving. The beeches along the drive held snow in their branches until mid-month, and Thomas cleared it from the glass-house roof every second day with a long-handled brush, working slowly and methodically along the ridge, his breath visible in the cold air. Marion worked. She had developed by now a routine so ingrained that the days passed in a flow that was less like a sequence of separate moments than like a single continuous act of attention. The study in the mornings, the glasshouse in the afternoons, the West Wing studio in the early evenings by lamplight. She had learned the collection, not fully, not yet, but enough that she could move through it with a sense of orientation, could recognize the relationships between specimens and between notebooks, could see the architecture of it. In the third week of January, she reached the notebooks of the last decade, the 1880s. Sir Edmund had been in his 60s, his 70s, slowing physically, but not, it was clear, mentally. The observations in these notebooks were as acute as those of 30 years earlier, the connections as far-reaching, the capacity for surprise intact. But there was a quality in these later notebooks of a person beginning, quietly and without drama, to look back as well as forward. Not nostalgically. He was not a nostalgic man, she had gathered, but with a kind of taking stock, a reviewing of what had been, a checking of the accounts, in the most generous sense. He wrote, in a notebook from 1883, a passage that she read 3 times. "I have spent 40 years learning to look at things. I am not sure I am finished. I suspect I am not. The more carefully one looks, the more there is to see. Not in the sense of accumulation, not simply more information, but in the sense of depth. The same field studied for 10 years shows you things that the same field studied for 1 year cannot. This is not remarkable, and yet it is always remarkable." She copied this into her own notebook. She was not in the habit of copying other people's words. She would not have called herself a person who kept quotations, but she copied this one and then sat looking at it for a while. By February, she had reached the last 50 notebooks. These were quieter, shorter. The entries sometimes only a few sentences. Not because he had less to say, but because the writing itself had become difficult. The handwriting was larger and less controlled. The entries often dated several days apart, when previously they had been daily. She read these slowly, with the particular care she would have given to something fragile. The last notebook had been begun in August and ended in September. The final entry was dated the 14th of September, 3 weeks before he had died. It was a single sentence, and it took her a moment to pass the handwriting, which was at its least legible in these final pages. The bird's nest, orchids in the wood, will be fruiting now. I should like to have seen them. She put the notebook down on the desk very carefully and sat with her hands in her lap and the study lamp making its small warm circle on the desk around her. And she did not say anything because there was no one to say anything to. And she did not move for a while because she was 40 years in a wood in June, kneeling by an old oak tree, feeling a thing for the first time that she would spend her whole life trying to find again. After a time, she picked up her own notebook and pen and went on with her work. February gave way to March and March to April, and in April, Dunmore Hall underwent, as it presumably did every year, the specific transformation that belongs to houses in the English countryside at the turning of the season. It was not dramatic. It never was in this part of Shropshire, which seemed to consider drama an extravagance when gradual change was available. But it was real. The quality of the light changed first, became more horizontal, then more warm, then more golden in the afternoons. Then the garden, Thomas moving through it every morning with a different quality of purpose, the beds beginning to show the first small green eruptions of what had been underground since November. Then the walled garden, then the drive, the beeches putting out their new leaves in that particular pale and luminous green that seems to emit rather than reflect light. Marion had been at Dunmore for 6 months. The catalogue was, by her calculation, approximately 2/3 complete. She had read all 843 notebooks, had catalogued 612 botanical specimens, had inventoried 211 of Catherine's studies. She had written 3 letters to Professor Ashby at Kew, and had begun a paper on 3 of the most significant finds in the collection, including the Shropshire record of a species previously known only from 2 sites in Wales, which was going to cause a considerable amount of interest when it was published. She had written to her editor at the journal and to the friends in London whose gatherings she had missed all winter, and the letters had been gracious and affectionate. But she had also been, in the writing of them, aware of a particular quality of distance. Not that she had drifted from those people, but that the world they inhabited felt less immediately real to her than it had 6 months ago, and the world she currently inhabited felt more so. She thought about this on an April morning in the glasshouse, which in spring was extraordinary. The orchids in full bloom, the climbing vine putting out its impossibly large leaves, the ferns unfurling into new growth in a continuous, slow performance of green upon green. She was sitting on the bench at the far end, which had become, over the months, something like her bench. She sat there often, at the end of an afternoon's work, for 20 minutes or half an hour, doing nothing in particular, which was a habit she had not previously had and had developed here without noticing it. She thought about the question of what she was going to do when the work was finished. She had, in London, a set of rooms in Bloomsbury that she rented from an elderly colleague and kept with the spare and functional organization of a person who is often absent and wants the minimum of management when present. She had her library, her correspondence, her work with the Linnean Society, her teaching. She gave 6 lectures a year at a small independent school for girls in Islington, a commitment she had taken on 4 years ago and found more rewarding than she had expected. She had her friends, her colleagues, her routines, the specific geography of her London days, the walk to Kew on Tuesdays, the library on Thursdays, the particular coffee house on Gray's Inn Road where she sometimes spent a morning writing. None of these things seemed, considered from the bench in the Dunmore glasshouse in April, inadequate. They were good things. She valued them. She intended to return to them. But she had begun to think about what she would write when she left. Not the formal catalogue. That was a given. That was the work she had been engaged to do. Something else. Something that used the catalogue as its scaffolding, but went somewhere that a catalogue, by its nature, could not go. Something about what a collection of this kind meant. Not just its scientific significance, but its human meaning. The thing it represented when you understood it whole. The 40 years of notebooks, the 843 records of careful looking, Catherine's 300 studies, the glasshouse and the wood, and the old oak and the bird's nest orchids that had flowered in June every year for half a century, while a man came to see them. Something, in other words, about what it meant to pay attention, not as an abstraction, as a life. She opened her notebook and began to write. Not notes, sentences, the first sentences of something larger. She wrote for 2 hours and was so absorbed in it that she did not hear Agnes ringing the bell for midday dinner, and Mrs. Aldous had to come to the glasshouse herself and find her there, pen moving, surrounded by the orchids and the ferns and the climbing vine, in a room full of things that had been gathered over a lifetime by a man who had understood that looking carefully at the world was not a consolation for not being part of it, but was, in fact, the most thorough way there was of belonging to it. She was still there, in June. This had required some renegotiation with Mr. Croft, who had expected the work to be complete by April, and some additional correspondence with the estate's trustees, who had been, in Mr. Croft's careful phrasing, surprised by the scope of the project. But the trustees, it turned out, were among Sir Edmund's former colleagues in natural history, and when they were told that Miss Hale was not only completing the catalogue, but was writing a monograph on the collection, a proper, publishable account of its scope and significance, they had been, again in Mr. Croft's phrasing, very satisfied with this development. The fee had been extended. The arrangement had continued. She had, by June, read the notebooks so many times, in so many different ways, that she was not entirely sure where Sir Edmund's observations ended and her own began. She had begun to see the world the way he had seen it, ecologically, relationally, in terms of communities of species and the long, slow conversations between them. And she suspected that this was not so much influence as recognition. She had always seen it this way, had just not had the vocabulary or the framework as clear as his notebooks had now made it. She had also, by June, become something she had not quite expected to become, a member of the household, not in any formal sense. But she sat at the kitchen table with Agnes in the early mornings and drank tea and listened to Agnes's detailed and opinionated account of the state of the kitchen garden. She walked the estate with Thomas on Saturday afternoons, learning the field names and the history of the walls and the places where specific species had been seen in specific years. She sat with Mrs. Aldous after dinner most evenings, and they had ceased somewhere in the winter to speak primarily about Sir Edmund and the collection, and had begun to speak more generally about things, about the world, about Mrs. Aldous's own considerable history, which was more interesting than Marion had initially guessed. She had written to London about extending her rooms for another quarter. The letter bag from her Bloomsbury landlord, Dr. Fairweather, had been genial and accommodating, and had included at the end a sentence that she had read with mild surprise. "I should mention that young Pearson at the college has been asking about the botanical collection you mentioned in your last letter. Seems very taken with the idea of it. Asked whether there might be access for students. I told him I would pass it on." She had not mentioned the collection to anyone who might send students to see it. Or rather, she had mentioned it to Fairweather himself in a letter in January, in the context of explaining why she was still in Shropshire. She had apparently described it with more feeling than she had realized, because he had apparently described it to a colleague, who had apparently described it to students. And the idea of the collection, of this particular collection, in this particular place, had apparently generated a kind of quiet interest that was spreading, as good things do, person by person, through the networks of people who cared about such things. She thought Sir Edmund would have been pleased. On a morning in the second week of June, she went to the wood. She had been several times since November, in various weathers and various seasons. But she had not been in June. She went alone, early, before breakfast, while the dew was still on the fields, wearing her boots and her old walking coat, and carrying her notebook, and she crossed the fields in the morning light and went into the wood. The summer wood was entirely different from the winter wood. The canopy was full, the light coming through it green and dappled, and in constant slow motion as the leaves moved in the light June wind. The ground beneath was dense with dog's mercury and wood anemone, and the long-leafed clusters of wild garlic already past its flowering. The air smelled of everything growing at once, of deep soil and new leaf, and the particular sweetness of a wood in full season. She went to the clearing by the old oak. They were there, just as the notebooks had said, just as Thomas had said, just as they had been every June for the length of a man's memory, and long before that. The bird's nest, orchids, Neotia nidus avis, rising from the leaf mould in their pale and ghostly dozens, the flowers already open, their strange bone-coloured spikes dispersing a faint and curious sweetness into the still air of the clearing. She crouched and looked at them for a long time. She looked at them with the same attention that she had been practicing and refining for 21 years, and with the specific attention of someone who has spent 8 months reading the records of another person looking at exactly these plants in exactly this place. And she felt she would not have tried to explain this to anyone who had not also spent time with the notebooks, but she felt it clearly. She felt a kind of continuity, the long thread of noticing passing from one person to another in this clearing, the same plants returning as they always had to the same ground, the same fungal networks in the same darkness of the soil, observed and recorded and wondered at in a chain of Juness that went back to 1843 and would, if she had anything to do with it, continue. She opened her notebook. She wrote the date. She wrote the species name. She wrote colony extensive, in vigorous condition, estimated 60 plus flowering spikes. The quality of the morning light is exactly as he described in the 1865 notebook, a diffuse greenish illumination that makes the flowers appear to be lit from inside. Then she sat back on her heels and put the notebook away and just looked for a while without writing anything. After a time, she heard from somewhere in the wood behind her the single two-note call of a wood pigeon, the sound so deep and so rhythmic and so entirely appropriate to green June wood that she felt it like a sound she had heard before, in memory or in some other version of this morning, and she closed her eyes for a moment and breathed the air of the clearing, warm now as the sun climbed, the leaf mould and the greenery and the faint sweetness of the orchids. And she thought about attention, about what it meant to give your attention to a thing, to a place, to the specific and unrepeatable quality of a morning in a wood in June. She thought about how 8 months ago she had not known this wood existed. She thought about the train from London and the dark lane and the house appearing at the end of the beach drive and the door opening and the lamplight. She thought about how the most significant arrivals are often the ones you don't see coming. She opened her eyes. The orchids were still there, doing what orchids do, surviving, flowering, completing the intricate transaction of their reproduction with the unseen partners of the soil. They had been doing this in this clearing since before the oak was an oak, and they would be doing it long after everything she had built and known and written was gone. This was not a dispiriting thought. It was, if anything, the opposite. She stood and brushed the leaf mould from her coat and walked back through the wood in the June morning. The monograph took the rest of the summer to write. She had thought it would be shorter than it turned out to be. She had thought, when she began it, that it would be perhaps 40 pages, a considered introduction to the collection with some account of its significance and method. By the time she was finished, it was considerably longer than that, and it was not quite the thing she had planned, because the thing she had planned had not quite taken into account what the writing itself would require. Writing at the level she was attempting, writing that tried to do justice to something she considered genuinely important, always required more of her than she anticipated. Not more time, though it required that too, but more honesty, more willingness to say what she actually thought rather than the conventional version of it. She had found this difficult in her earlier publications, when she was still establishing herself and the temptation to write safely was considerable. She found it somewhat less difficult now. She wrote the monograph at Sir Edmund's desk, in the morning light, in the autumn light, in the lamplight, as October came back around. She wrote about the collection structure and its logic, about the ecological organization that was its most distinctive feature, about the most significant individual specimens and their relationships to broader questions of species, distribution, and conservation. She wrote about Catherine's studies, which she argued, with evidence and with care, deserved to be understood not as supplementary material to the botanical collection, but as a parallel collection of equal significance, a record of the same world viewed through a different instrument. And at the end, in a section that she rewrote 4 times and then left, finally, with the imperfection of something that has been worked as hard as it can be and has to be allowed to stand, she wrote about what the collection meant, about what it represented, about what it showed about the relationship between a human life and the living world it occupied, what happened when you paid close and sustained and loving attention to the things around you, what kind of knowledge resulted, what kind of understanding, what kind of life. She did not mention Sir Edmund by name in this final section. She mentioned the notebooks, the glasshouse, the wood, the bird's nest orchids in the clearing by the old oak. She mentioned the foxglove watercolour and the unfinished hellebore. She did not mention the packet of letters in the back of the drawer, because those were private and always would be. But the existence of them, the fact that a man of such self-containment had kept them there, close to where he worked, for years, informed what she wrote without her needing to say why. When she had finished the last page, it was a November evening, raining, and she had been at Dunmore Hall for 13 months. She put the manuscript on the desk and looked at it, a stack of closely written pages, her own neat hand, the lamp making its small amber circle. She felt the particular tiredness of finished work, which is different from other tiredness, not depletion, but completion, the body's recognition that the sustained effort of a long project has come to its end. She went downstairs and found Mrs. Aldous in the small sitting room and said that she had finished the manuscript, and Mrs. Aldous said that this called for something other than tea, and produced from the back of a cupboard a bottle of very good sherry that had been there, she explained, since Sir Edmund's last birthday, which he had not been well enough to celebrate properly, and had asked her to keep for an appropriate occasion. They sat by the fire and drank the sherry, which was excellent, and did not talk much, and it was, in its quiet and unhurried way, one of the finest evenings Marion had spent in 13 months, which was saying something. After a time, Mrs. Aldous said, "Will you go back to London?" Marion held her glass and looked at the fire. "The manuscript has to go to London. The catalogue has to go to the trustees and to Kew. There are people I should see." She paused. "But I think I will come back." Mrs. Aldous looked at her with the expression that Marion had learned to recognize over 13 months as the particular expression of someone who is not surprised. "The orchids will flower in June," she said. "Yes." Marion looked at the fire. "I know. She came back in March, as she had said she would. The manuscript had been delivered to her publisher in January and was received with considerable interest, rather more than she had anticipated, partly because of the quality of the botanical content, and partly because of the final section which her editor had described in a letter that Marion read with some surprise as unlike anything else of its kind, by which she meant it was written by a person who had found something in the material that exceeded the material, and had been honest enough to say so. She had spent February in London. She had gone to the library at the Linnean Society, to the coffee house on Gray's Inn Road, to the college where she gave her 6 lectures a year, to the evenings with the friends and colleagues who were the fabric of her London life. She had found all of these things exactly as she had left them, and had been genuinely glad of them, and had also found, in the specific way of someone who has been somewhere else for a long time, that what had seemed like the full scope of her world before she left was now one part of a larger scope. She arrived at Dunmore Hall on a March evening, cold and clear, the sky above the low hills full of stars. Silas was there with the carriage. He said good evening in his flat Shropshire voice, and secured her trunk with his accustomed efficiency, and they drove the 4 miles in silence through the dark lane. The branches of the beeches bare and silver in the moonlight, and at the end of the drive the house appeared, lit in several windows, and she looked at it and felt the feeling she had felt on the first night, the curious feeling of recognition, of having arrived. The work was different now. The main catalogue was done, submitted to Kew and to the trustees, who had received it with the satisfaction of people who have been waiting a long time for something to be done properly, and are glad to find that it has been. What remained was not less interesting, only different in scale and kind. The ongoing work of a collection that was now being properly established as a research resource, which required correspondence and coordination, and the occasional visit from scholars who were beginning to make the journey to Dunmore to see specimens that had previously been unknown to them. She managed this with the same methodical care she brought to everything, and found it more satisfying than she had expected. There was a particular pleasure in seeing other people encounter the collection for the first time, watching the recognition cross their faces when they understood what they were looking at. Mr. Croft came in April with the trustees, who were 4 elderly naturalists of great distinction, and they spent a day in the study and the glasshouse and the West Wing studio. And at the end of the day, one of them, a professor of botany from Edinburgh, very white-haired and very direct, said to Marion across the dinner table, "This is the finest thing of its kind I have seen in private hands. It deserves to endure." She agreed. She intended to make sure it did. Thomas's son was learning the garden. He was 19, a quiet young man who had his father's patience with plants and was slowly acquiring his father's knowledge of Dunmore, specifically the particular history and character of each bed and border and the kitchen garden. And eventually, when Thomas judged the time right, the wood, Agnes had a niece who was coming to learn the cooking, which Agnes described as necessary on the grounds that she was not young, and someone had to know the recipes. Mrs. Aldous had shown no sign of any intention to leave or to slow down, and appeared, if anything, to be enjoying the increased activity in the house with the equanimity of a woman who has always known that a house functions better when it has a purpose. In the second week of June, She went to the wood. She went early, alone, in the morning light, the same way she had gone the year before, her boots and her coat and her notebook. The fields were different in June, high with grass, heavy with the smell of meadow flowers, the hedgerows white with elderflower, the sky a deep and cloudless blue that was rare enough in Shropshire to feel like a gift. She walked through all of this and went into the wood and walked to the clearing. The orchids were there. They were always there in June, in the clearing by the old oak. They would be there next year, and the year after, and the year after that, returning from the mycorrhizal darkness of the soil to the June light of the clearing, completing their transaction with the world, observed and recorded and attended to as long as there was anyone willing to come and look. She crouched and looked at them for a long time, in the way she had learned to look at things, with all of her attention, with nothing held back, with the willingness to be changed by what she saw. She was 31 years old. She had been paying close attention to the world for 23 years, and she was not finished. She suspected she would not be finished for a very long time, perhaps not ever, which was not a daunting thought, but an encouraging one. The wood was quiet around her. The dappled light moved on the leaf mould. The orchids stood in their pale and patient dozens. She opened her notebook and wrote the date. She wrote, "The orchids are flowering. The colony is in excellent condition. I'm here. The morning is clear, and the light in the clearing is, as it always seems to be in June, exactly right." She paused. Then she added, beneath the careful observation, in the same small hand, "I think this is what it means. Not to have all the answers, but to keep coming back to the question year after year, in the right place, at the right time, with your eyes open, to find, in the returning itself, the thing you were looking for." She closed the notebook. She stayed in the clearing for a while longer, not writing, not counting or classifying or recording, just sitting in the June morning, present in the particular way that very long practice of attention makes possible, aware of the light and the smell of the leaf mould and the quiet and the wood pigeons calling somewhere in the green canopy above her. Then she stood and walked back through the wood toward the house, toward the work, toward the long and patient and endlessly interesting life of a person who has found her place in the world and intends gratefully and wholeheartedly to keep it. The foxglove was flowering in Dunmore Wood. The bird's nest orchids were done for another year. The glasshouse breathed its green and complicated breath through the old walls of the house, and the notebooks stood ranked on their shelves in the study, 843 records of careful looking, waiting to be read by anyone who would come and pay them the same quality of attention that made them. The beeches along the drive held their full summer leaves. The day was long and warm and quiet. Everything for now was as it should be.